Hello everyone, welcome to the Sextech Data and Health panel. I'm feeding back a little bit, but I hope it sounds okay in the room. It's a little bouncy to us. Before we begin the panel, I'd like to acknowledge that those of us who are in the room together are meeting today on the country of the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation, that sovereignty was never ceded, and this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and also extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are here with us today. I'm going to give us a brief introduction or a scene setting for the panel today, and then introduce our panelists, or indeed invite them to introduce themselves. They are Dr. Zara Stardust from Queensland University of Technology, Dr. Jasant Floor from RMIT, Jenny Kennedy from RMIT, also doctor, and Anna Shimshak from Monash. My name is Kath Albury. I'm Professor of Media and Communication at Swinburne University of Technology. And today we're coming together to have a bit of a dialogue about some of the recent research that all of us have been doing in relation to sex tech. So why are we here? Digital technologies, as we know, are rapidly changing the ways that people navigate their public and private lives and practices of digital intimacy. And these include things like using dating and hookup apps, or using apps for sexual health information and self-tracking, for example, period tracking apps. These practices are increasingly ordinary and quite mundane. But we are here to talk about, I guess, one of the literally sexier aspects of this emerging field of technology, which is known as sex tech. And that's really a very broad catch-all term. It's applied to dating apps, yes, but also to sexual entertainment platforms and services. So that's things like OnlyFans or cam sites. And it's also been applied to networked sex toys and AI-powered sex robots. The field of sex tech overlaps with femtech, a related term that is broadly applied, again, both to sex toys and apps and platforms, specifically those that support women's sexual and reproductive health and well-being. So sex tech and femtech have recently emerged as a site in which sexual pleasure and also sexual negotiation are increasingly understood as data via apps, sensors and tracking platforms that seek to quantify sexual experience. And I should add that this is not new. There are very long histories of quantifying sex in this way, which I talk about a bit in our recent co-authored book, Everyday Data Cultures. But in recent years, we've seen increasing numbers of reports of non-consensual data collection and increasing concerns regarding data privacy and security. And these concerns don't just apply to commercial or what you might term recreational forms of sex tech. Recent research has found that members of marginalised communities, including those most affected by HIV and STIs, have been found to mistrust top-down Australian digital health initiatives due to data privacy concerns. And this mistrust is not unfounded given the levels of stigma and discrimination around sexual difference and gender difference in Australia. And recent Commonwealth of Australia research is pretty, I guess, disappointing or distressing about how high the levels of discrimination and stigma remain around STIs and HIV particularly. So in terms of sex tech itself, the Australian startup environment is relatively small, but it includes a number of women, trans and non-binary people who are trying to push back against a space that they see as stigmatised or limiting, and engage with sexual health innovation and sex tech. So this has provided everyone here with a really fertile space for engaging and collaborating with health professionals, with community artists, activists, technologists, and also designers. And so I'm very happy to bring together today this panel of emerging researchers from across the Centre for Automated Decision Making and Society to ask how sex tech is supporting or undermining our collective capacity to access safe, pleasurable sexual experiences and culturally appropriate sexual health services. To do that, we're going to share some of our preliminary findings from the recent public interest Sextech hackathon partnership with ThoughtWorks and Brian Nicole's Sextech School, which is a training program for Sextech entrepreneurs, which Zara, Jenny and myself recently worked with. And before we go into that deeper dive, what I'm going to do is invite each of our panelists to introduce themselves, and then we'll talk about what we learned at our Sextech hackathon. We're also going to hear about research into the politics of sex robots and the intersection of sex data and health more broadly. But to start off, each panelist, please, if you could give me a very brief self-introduction. What does our audience need to know today? But also, can you tell us very briefly how you came to research sex tech? Can I start with you, Zara?
Yes, sure, and thank you all so much for coming. I came to Sextech from porn studies, and my PhD I did with Kath at UNSW, and it was all about the regulation of queer and feminist pornography. I was working as a performer, and I was interested in the kind of ethical production practices that people were taking that were much more sophisticated than government approaches to porn regulation. But also in that work, a lot of the issues that came up were around financial discrimination against sex workers and exclusion, deplatforming from social media sites. I then came to sex tech through Kate Devlin's book, Turned On, Sex, Science and Robots, and she talks about 2 hackathons that she held in the UK in 2016 and 17, and instead of focusing on kind of very hyper-feminized sex robots, the participants came up with all these different types of warm furry blankets that could give you inflatable hugs, and types of robots that were much more post-human and genderless and abstract in their form. And I began listening to Brian Nicole's podcast, The Future of Sex, where she talks about a whole range of different issues, from sex in space to cannabis lube. And there was, I guess, a bit of a disconnect for me in terms of a lot of the hubris and excitement around the potential of sex tech, and then at the same time a really increasingly onerous regulatory environment around the policing of sex in online space, content suppression and surveillance, and thinking about how the problems were being positioned and how the solutions were being positioned. And before academia, I was working as a policy analyst in the space of LGBTIQ health and sex worker rights. And so I had done a lot of work around HIV treatment and prevention, and thinking about a whole range of different issues like criminalization and legal frameworks and barriers to access and stigma, and was very wary of government surveillance and also of tech policy too. So I started to think about, well, what would sex tech look like if, from that perspective that was in the service of communities, and how might it serve a different purpose, not just sexual health, but thinking about sexual rights and sexual justice, thinking about what Malavika was saying this morning, like not just fairness and accountability and transparency and explainability, but what about reparations? Can we have counter-surveillance sex tech? And I was doing a fellowship over at the Berkman Klein Center at Harvard, and there were 2 events that I attended that were quite formational in that thinking, and one was the Algorithmic Justice League run drag versus AI workshops, where you can go to the webinar and practice using your hair and makeup and craft to try and obfuscate and become unintelligible and incoherent to the facial recognition technology. And that was really amazing. And then we also I went to this amazing session by Sasha Costanza-Chock and Joanna Varon, who have created these amazing oracle cards for trans-feminist tech, which are like an old school tarot form of divination that you can use as a speculative fiction exercise to try and imagine new technologies. And that was run by Decoding Stigma, which was a sex worker collective in New York. And so that really shifted my thinking away from those really narrow policy legal solutions to these issues, and thinking, well, what about speculative dreaming and what about speculative imagining? And what would sex tech look like if we took like a design justice approach to it? So that's how I ended up coming to this space and how we ended up coordinating the first public interest sex tech hackathon.
Awesome, thank you. Jazz, what brought you to work on sex tech?
History did. So when I was doing my PhD, at the start, it was going to be about historicizing the place or lack of place of asexuality in queer communities. Following very intense discussions with my co-supervisor, who was Stephen Angelides, who you might know, we came to the conclusion that historically in the sexual sciences, and I'm referring here to mainstream psychiatry and sexology, there has been a big shift around the 70s and civil rights movements from pathologizing object choice to pathologizing quantity. And so my PhD was very much focused on historicizing that question of how much is it enough, how much is too little, how much is too much. So tracing the various pathologies in sexology and psychiatry and mapping how alongside those pathologies, or rather entangled with those pathologies, a bunch of techniques and technologies emerge at the same time. So whether it's the black and white book of classification, or it's the new questionnaires that psychiatry and sexology uses, and the very end of my PhD was on new pharmaceuticals. So at the time, I was finishing the PhD, and a pharmaceutical called ADM came on the scene, approved by the Food and Drug Administration in the US, not in Australia, I don't think so still, which was meant to be the pink Viagra. It works in a, well, it's debatable whether it works. 0.08 more satisfying sexual encounters for women is not good enough. But that was evidence enough to get approval. And so the last chapter of the PhD was kind of delving into, the ideas that various medical institutions, including psychiatry, developed around what is a female brain in desire, what is a male brain in desire. And so towards the end, kind of chatting to people and chatting to my co-author on the piece I'm going to be talking about today, Kiran Pina, we came to the conclusion that with pharmaceutical also comes a bunch of networked technologies. And of course, you need to submit your PhD at some point. I did not talk about that within the thesis, but then after finishing it and writing up my book, I decided to delve a bit deeper into network technologies, which also matched with the same time that I started my first postdoc, which is on advanced technologies and mental health. But I have a very kind of, Foucauldian genealogy perspective on it. And so, so we started delving into some of the sex techs that exist out there, and we decided to focus the paper on wireless sex toys that are designed to increase intimacy between partners who are distanced. And I'll talk more about that.
Awesome, thank you. And it was really interesting to me when I was beginning to think about sex tech myself as part of the Everyday Data Cultures project, to look at some of the histories of the datification of gendered bodies and the establishment of a normative standard for good sex. And when I was looking at a particular wireless sex toy, which all of us on this panel have probably looked at, the Lioness, which gives you a graphic feedback of your arousal and your orgasm through sensors in the vibrator. I was really interested in how it might map onto Masters and Johnson's human sexual arousal diagram that many of us would have seen in high school sex ed or maybe in cosmopolitan sealed sections as we were growing up. And the notion that, a satisfying experience of sexuality is one that can be graphically mapped and datified, and that we can measure ourselves against it in that way. So it's interesting to think what a long history there is of this means of understanding bodies and gender and sexuality. Jenny, what brought you to the space of sex tech?
Yeah, I have to say I never expected to be here. I took a right turn somehow. I started by looking at technologies as they are incorporated into the home. So probably for about 10 years I've been looking at the ways people acquire, adopt and engage with devices in the home and the way that interacts with the material spaces, but also the social dynamics in the home, how homes are organised around their digital practices. And through the course of that work, I guess there were a number of very gendered patterns occurring, both in terms of the people that were selecting the devices to be brought into the home. I was finding in that research it was typically men in the home that would select the devices, that would set the devices up, that would manage things like interoperability, passwords, etc. And then towards partway through some of that research, we started to see a proliferation of smart speakers in the home and voice assistants in the home. And I had met Yolandi, who was doing similar work around device and technology in the home, but looking more from an energy perspective. And she and I were presenting work about the gendered uptake of technology in the home, and got to talking about how not only was it men using the home, but also there were now this whole suite of devices that were very purposefully feminized in their nature. They were feminized in terms of the name of them, the series, the Alexas, but also the voices that were defaulted in these smart speakers were also feminine. And we started to think about kind of the consequences of not only the name and the vocalness of the femininity, but also the purpose that the devices were intended to fulfill within the home, this very kind of subservient, passive, but very supportive nature. And so we started calling them the smart wives. We wrote a book about it. And in the course of doing the research for the book, we came across sex robots. And we had already encountered, I guess, some kind of tongue-in-cheek articles about people forming intimate or romantic attachments to their devices because it was, they're calling them the idealized relationship because they were always available to them and always there, but never had needs of their own. But then through that, we also came across marketing for a number of sex robots that had AI functionality and that were being marketed not so much as sexual companions, but more as full romantic companions. So the ideal partner, because they would never nag at you, was one of the marketing taglines. So we had quite a debate about it, about is there a place for sex robots in the book? We're talking about, we thought we're talking about domestic devices. But if these are devices that are coming into the home and being used in the home, then they're domestic devices as well. So there ended up being a full chapter on the book about, well, what is this? Where is the spectrum in terms of smart devices and the feminization of smart devices? You have the very kind of the fully kind of physically feminized device versus then the kind of feminization of the purpose of the devices. And that just, I guess, triggered an interest for me in terms of what goes into the designing of these devices, what goes into the designing, especially in terms of the language processing and the kind of the conversational scripts that these devices have, what is and what the potential effects are of those kinds of scripts, not just sex robots, but also what's the purpose of the language that our, Google Home we're engaging with, in terms of how that informs how we engage with each other and how children in the home engage with various devices. And I love that, I can't remember which one it is, but one of the sex robots has a family mode, so she can sit and watch movies with the whole family. This idea of, they're available for all parts of your life. So I've kind of come from being much more focused on people, I guess, much more interested in people's experiences of devices and of the home itself into more now thinking about what else is happening in terms of the kinds of data that these devices are collecting, how that is being governed. So when Zara reached out to me and invited me to join on this project, I was like straight away like, yes, absolutely, not because I think I had anything to say about Sextech, but I knew it was something I wanted to know more about.
Awesome, thank you so much. Anna Shimshak was a participant in the Sextech hackathon, but also is undertaking her own research into Sextech. Anna, can you tell us a little bit about what it is you're doing and what brought you to your work?
Certainly. So I come to Sextech from a background actually in the arts. My artistic practice has historically looked at the representation of the body, and specifically women's bodies, in a lineage of art history, and thinking about this idea of depictions of eroticism and the kind of crossovers of where that hits potentials of violence. And in thinking about photography specifically, which is where my concentration is, looking at this kind of development of the representation of individuals and the body specifically, and the kind of politics embodied in that, for lack of a better word, and thinking about that in terms of both physical space and digital space, as we think about the ways in which images are shared and utilized today, but also the ways in which this connects to issues of privacy, surveillance, and the kinds of potentials, both for opportunities for sharing and for depictions of identity and ownership of that, but also where there's tremendous vulnerability within that. So in looking at Sextech in my own research, I'm specifically interested in how the body is represented. So thinking about the notions of the contemporary sex devices that we have in terms of sex toys, sex robots, even certain aspects of pornography, and how there's a kind of archetypal representation of the body that's overwhelmingly kind of popularized. There's increasingly more diversity in the types of bodies that we're seeing, but stereotypically there's a very strong kind of archetypal trope. And for me, there's a very evident connection to histories of representation in art history and in broader visual culture. And so thinking about the ways in which we can both imagine Sextech in the future in a way that includes a more encompassing and inclusive versions of bodies, but also thinking very critically about what are the politics of the way that we represent the bodies now, and what are the real world ramifications of this on real people, their conceptions, and the ways in which these technologies shape our treatment of each other and our conceptions of what sex is, and what those politics around sex can be.
Awesome, thank you so much. And I'm going to come back to you in a minute to hear more about your experiences of the hackathon, but I thought first I would ask Zara to introduce the hackathon to the people here. There is a project report which is available on the apo.org website, and we also have hard copies for the people who are physically here. Can you tell us what we did, what happened, and what surprised you, and what did you learn through the process?
Yes, well, firstly, shout out to Nick for printing these really amazing reports for us, and to Kathy Nichols for designing them. There's a bunch here, please grab one on your way out. We also have a few leftover copies of Revolting Prostitutes, which is a book which was one of our prizes that was donated by Assembly 4, who are a sex work and technology collective here in Melbourne. So there's 5 copies there that could go to Best in, Best Dressed. And yeah, the hackathon that we ran as a 3-day event in February. It was meant to happen here in Melbourne at the ThoughtWorks office, and ThoughtWorks had these big plans of like providing pizza and drinks and having media, and it was going to be this really amazing event where we were all in person. But then of course there was a massive COVID spike and we had to transition the entire thing to be virtual. But we partnered with ThoughtWorks, who are a global software technology firm, as well as the Sextech School, founded by Bryony Cole, which is like a private training academy for sex tech startups and would-be professionals. So that was great to work with them. And I guess one of the impetus behind it was as Kath and Jazz have mentioned, like the ways in which sexual data is now being collected through especially sex tracking devices and femtech devices, thinking about the repeal of Roe v. Wade and how that kind of intimate data might be used for various political purposes. And Sextech collects so much information about your kind of sexual health, your status, your masturbation habits, all sorts of information, and we were interested in the data logics behind what was happening to that and how was it being collected and stored responsibly or not. There are also a couple of studies that suggested that there were multiple security vulnerabilities found in Sextech devices that meant that they could easily be hacked, and leading to things like remote sexual assault. And there are a few cases where a bunch of different Sextech companies had settled where their users had complained that they had shared their intimate data. They were collecting it non-consensually and without the knowledge of the users, and they had big legal settlements as a result of that. So I guess that was what led us there. The hackathon itself, we framed as a public interest Sextech hackathon, and public interest is technologies. There's a lot of discussion about what that means. Often it focuses on the common good, but I think sometimes that can obscure the needs of many marginalised communities in particular. So we really try to encourage people to think about like not only how their designs that they came up with would contribute to like human rights or social justice or political change, but also like how they will resist surveillance capitalism or structural oppressions, how they're not just individualistic types of products, but something that is for the collective good, something that's evidence-based and led by communities, something that enriches communities rather than business, is environmentally sustainable, and something that redistributes wealth or resources or power or knowledge. So that was kind of the theoretical underpinning of it. We invited people with a range of different skills. So we invited people who had like special skills like fabricators and developers and software engineers, designers, technologists, but we also wanted people with particular expertise. So we had a lot of sex therapists, sex educators, digital rights advocates, public health experts, and we also wanted, importantly, people who were impacted and disproportionately affected by sex technologies, especially LGBTIQ communities, people with HIV, people with disability, and sex workers. And so the challenge was to come up with some kind of sex technology that met 5 different criteria. The first was it had to be relevant, so it had to respond to the needs of marginalised communities. It had to be in the public interest. It had to take an ethical approach to collection and storage of data, so it had to be kind of privacy aware. The design had to feature collaborative processes and accessible and inclusive interfaces, and it had to be creative, so it had to offer like an innovative solution to a social, cultural, economic, regulatory or structural problem. And we really deliberately didn't use criteria that had been used in other Sextech hackathons that were around viability and commerciality and scalability of the product. Although we might talk about that later, people did go in that direction even though it wasn't necessarily the intention at the time. We had a bunch of prizes that were donated to us, including by Sextech EU, who are a big conference that happens over in Berlin every year, so the winners could go over and have mentoring sessions with the founder of that and be able to develop their project even further. We also had access to the Sextech school cohort as a prize. We had vouchers, $100 vouchers from Love Honey, so people could buy their own sex toys, which was a very popular prize. And we had different books, as I mentioned before, Revolting Prostitutes. We had We Too, Essays on Sex Work and Survival. We had Ruby Hamad's White Tears, Brown Scars, and we had the Bumpin' Book of Love, Lust and Disability. So most of those books were donated by Assembly 4 as well as Love Honey. And we had a bunch of people who were there as mentors throughout the day, throughout the 3 days. And so the way that it was structured was we had a community panel on the first day. We had the kind of speculative design exercises that Kath ran through Miro. Then people would on the second day, we ran an exercise using the Oracle cards for transfeminist tech, which was really fun to do speculative design exercises. Then people did group work in consultation with their mentors, and then on the last day, they had to pitch. They had 5 minutes to pitch and 5 minutes to answer questions from the judges. We also had some really amazing speakers, one of whom is here today, Sam Floriani from Digital Rights Watch, who was a speaker and one of our judges. And the speakers had really amazing provocations for the participants. So Sam spoke a lot about the ways in which surveillance isn't sexy. You know, you can think about protecting privacy as a form of community care and solidarity, and listed a range of different principles that people could build in to be a feature of their product, like data minimization and necessity and proportionality. And then we had Eliza Sorensen from Assembly 4, who talked a lot about the very onerous political environment and the legislative environment around Sextech and how difficult it had been to run their business. So they started this platform called Twitter, which is a sex worker alternative to Twitter, but unfortunately they've closed down now around Valentine's Day in response to the very onerous regulatory framework. So they were really showing that, like, working in Sextech is not just about the pink fluffy handcuffs. Actually, there's all of these really tricky things you have to think about, like what happens when you create technology that actually harms the people, your own communities, and how do you avoid that? We had a really amazing community panel who spoke about a range of different things, including the risks of data collection for sex workers and people living with HIV in terms of bullying and harassment, doxing, and arrest. We had people talking about disability in the ways in which the designs were often inaccessible, or they're very heteronormative and able-bodied. We had trans folks talking about the ways in which authentication and verification practices and biometric data collection impacted trans people. We had Kat Gledhill-Tucker, who's a Noongar technologist, talking about the ways in which Sextech didn't pay attention to Indigenous protocols, for example, around dating and also around sacred knowledge. And so there were lots of really amazing kind of provocations that participants could grapple with throughout the few days. And in the end, they came up with 5 different pitches on the Sunday. The first was an Organic Matters group, which was all about sustainable sex tech, and they wanted to have a research and manufacturing centre that investigated a whole bunch of things like algae lube and mycelial networks and pineapple husks to kind of create sustainable sex tech in consultation and partnership with local Indigenous groups. We had a group that created a product called Chameleon, which was based on lipstick and the idea that you could have this lipstick that changed colour to keep you safe, and to, you know, would only kind of give out parts of your identity in particular situations depending on where you were and whether you consented. We had a platform that focused on co-design that would put tech companies in contact with marginalised communities in order to do kind of social impact assessments and assess the kinds of products that they wanted to create. We had a pitch that was about a community space based around the social model of disability that was all about minimal data collection and human content moderation and queer community standards. And then we had this really cool communication protocol that was all about it was based in the experience of neurodivergent users on dating apps and the ways in which communication can sometimes go wrong, and they had developed a protocol that would allow people to assess what is their preferred communication style, and then use that as a source for potential matches. So there were questions like, do you like to info dump? Maybe that's something that people should know about you. Or, you know, what is your preferred way of being rejected? Like, do you just want the facts, or do you want to be let down gently? and so I think that's a really useful thing for everybody, really, to be able to know more about our sexual selves, and something that could be and built upon as well. So that were the key things that people came up with. You can read about them more in our in our report, but there were a lot of really interesting kind of feedback from judges too in the discussions after that, in terms of like, what are the lessons for sex tech businesses moving forward? And one of the key things was, well, actually, it's a lot harder than people think. You know, actually, there's lots of legal changes that need to happen to make public interest sex tech even possible. There's going to be a whole lot of barriers to accessing finance and hosting and funding. If you're going to have an advisory board, you need to think about, well, like, how are people going to be compensated for their time and their expertise and lived experience? How will that not be tokenistic? And maybe build partnership and joint ownership models instead. And also, like, what happens when it goes wrong? What are your accountability processes? And like, how are you going to deal with police who want to infiltrate your platform, and what are your policies going to be on that? So it was a real eye-opener, I think, for many people to think about, well, what does this really look like in practice?
Awesome, thank you. Jenny, as another person involved in the hackathon, what surprised you most, and what did you learn through the process?
I learned so much. I mean, even just the lead up to it was a learning process, but then the actual event was just, I guess, mind-blowing, really. Like you say, like, our mentors and our expert speakers at the start were fantastic. But for me, I guess, being new to the sex tech space, what I was really surprised by, or keen to learn more about, was just the degree of vulnerabilities in the infrastructures, and just the complexities, and just so many different ways in which harms can be both, you know, just inadvertently caused to the communities of users by not thinking through those many, many layers that you've just outlined there, Zara. I was also, I guess, struck by there being kind of the inadequacies of the current regulatory frameworks that these devices, apps, platforms, etc., are having to design within, and the variations as well across different jurisdictions, which also makes it very complex. And the other thing that I know I kind of brought up a few times was kind of an amusement in that there's another ADM+S project that I'm working on together with Anna and a number of other people in the centre and elsewhere, looking at voice tech, entertainment, smart technologies for children. And the exact same conversations that we were having about children's smart tech, we were also having around sex tech, in terms of security vulnerabilities, in terms of variations in regulatory frameworks, and in terms of, I guess, really thinking about how there are devices being designed for vulnerable groups that are not in positions to advocate for themselves, and that the current regulatory responses are also not supporting them as well.
Fantastic, thank you. Anna, you were a participant in the hackathon as well as being a researcher in the space, wearing both hats. What was most surprising or interesting to you about participating in the 3-day experience?
I think for me, the thing that was really a standout was the tremendous creativity that was enabled by the speculative design process. Each kind of group or team had a combination of different skills and backgrounds that really kind of both complemented each other, but also were largely very diverse. And within that, there was very much a shift beyond the kind of pragmatic, beyond the tangible, as Zara mentioned, you know, beyond the marketability and feasibility of creation. And so thinking about the Oracle cards as the sort of catalyst point, it really sort of set a tone for sky's the limit, but also thinking beyond physical devices, which I think can oftentimes be a sort of default when people in general think about what sex tech is, and thinking about sex tech not just as pleasure devices, but as this broader framework of information, of protocols, of resources, of community, of protections, of health, and the ways in which the complexities are all layered within one another. And then looking at the ways in which the groups and their, you know, various expertises took these different qualities and challenges and really kind of rose to the occasion. I still think about the mycelium network, actually, because I think initially it was proposed as a sort of information and way of looking at commerce and capitalism, and a sort of subversion of that. And so thinking about how we can reimagine sex tech and what it could be, and the sort of potentials and real opportunity that is within the industry.
Thank you so much. Jean Burgess is giving me the eye across the room here at RMIT, because we talked a lot about mycelial networks as a metaphor for thinking about everyday data cultures, and have a kind of fluorescent mycelial network on the cover of the book, because we wanted to get away from the pale blue grid with a robot finger pointing at it as the visual representation of data. We wanted a living organism, and I think the event was really interesting for me because of the ways that the nuances of everyday life, as it pushes up against or works with technology, played out both in the process itself, moving a face-to-face hackathon to 3 days of Zoom is not easy, and I wouldn't recommend it. And no one, our partners had never done it before, and neither did we, and that was pretty intense. And so there were all of the standard kind of communication and working issues that you have on a kind of prolonged Zoom meeting. If you can imagine a 3-day Zoom meeting, you can imagine how good it was. But it was very interesting to think about how each group conceived of public interest sex tech and moving the space beyond the kind of the standard startup goals of scalability and marketability and pitchability and venture capital into a somewhat different space. Jazz, your work has looked at the healthification of data and the datafication of health. What is it in your work that you think is so interesting about the ways that wireless toys are being marketed?
The short answer would be some norms are incredibly tenacious. The long answer is, I think, part of my interest in the healthicization of sex is what we called it, because apparently it's what people before us used. Firstly, of course, it has a very long history. Marriage manuals in the 19th century already had a bit of a sprinkling of quantification, and that becomes much more intense with things like the self-help industry in the 20th century, pharmaceuticals in the 21st century, that sort of thing. But the key issue, I think, at the core of the healthicization of sex is that it needs to be quantified, and if it can be quantified, then it can be optimized. But it can only be optimized according to certain norms. And what we found in our we were mapping the sort of promissory discourses on different websites that were marketing wireless sex toys. Overwhelmingly white, overwhelmingly heterosexual, overwhelmingly able-bodied, down to the various detachable parts of the toys that you could buy separately. So one of the toys designed for cis men bodies firstly, it's focused on the act of penetration, and also, this is going to get a bit graphic, but you could buy a vagina sleeve that would be embedded in the toy, and it could stimulate penetrating a vagina. Surprise, surprise, vagina sleeve is pink and cream and really, kind of inoffensive looking. And so it's really stark to me that technology has this potential to both disrupt some of the norms that sometimes confine us, but overwhelmingly reaffirming a whole set of norms that don't actually match how a lot of people are living their lives. The big interest in the wireless kind of aspect of it was also this thing of we use the metaphor of data acting as a lubricant of long distance intimacy. So data is transmitted across distance to give pleasure to someone somewhere else. And again, all the marketing material, it was the pairing of, so one of the toys we looked at was Max, which was the kind of, targeted for cis men, and Nora targeted for cis women. And again, it's like this marketing around, oh, the G-spot and the, clitoris. There is no, firstly, it's not up to date with, current research in sexology and in psychiatry and sex that dispute the existence of the G-spot, or at least mention that not all bodies will have it, or not all bodies will have it in the same spot. There is this kind of, complete erasure of difference in the name of consumerism that always both surprises and doesn't surprise me. But I think the use of the language around health is also helpful to sell stuff, because it helps neutralize the taboo of sex a bit. It's like, but no, it's for your health, it's good for you. And one of the things that has happened in recent years is at a lot of well, not recent years because of COVID, but at a lot of the kind of innovative tech, last thing in tech festivals, all the stuff on sex and wireless sex toys has moved from its own section, which was on sex and gender, to sexual wellness. The term is more explicitly used now, and I think that helps companies make their way into the market and into people's homes.
Mm. And I know that Zara and Jenny and I have talked about the ways that that kind of marketing seems to us at times to be an attempt to sidestep the stigma associated with sex work, but that there is no way around that stigma, and many entrepreneurs in this space still complain about the lack of startup capital, for example, because sex work stigma is sticky. Is there anything you want to add to that?
Well, even just like as Jenny was saying earlier, like the similarities between children's toys and sex robots. There's like the security and privacy issues are often very similar, but the marketing is different, and often like that pitching as sexual wellness rather than a health device or a medical device is an attempt to kind of avoid regulation as well. But I will say something in relation to sexual health and, I guess, and big data, thinking about the ways in which sexual health kind of has moved over the last few decades into conversations about sexual rights and now sexual justice. And thinking back to some of the big international conferences in Cairo in '94 and Beijing in '95, where sexual health was a big topic of discussion and sexual rights was first kind of being iterated. And it was often pitched as kind of not just an absence of infirmary or disease, but we need something that's also positive, we need something that's pleasure focused. But the debates, it took many decades for pleasure to kind of come into the narrative. And now looking at like the World Association for Sexual Health has a declaration on sexual rights, they have a declaration on sexual pleasure, and now they're working on a declaration of sexual justice, which I think is much more broad, because it's not simply about kind of individual rights in relation to the state, but it's also about political economies and infrastructures and power and equity and distribution of wealth and knowledge and resources and things like that. But the kinds of data that continues to be collected, not just by sex toys, but by governments, for example, a lot of our state surveillance data and national surveillance data is very much about what is the prevalence of HIV, what is the incidence of chlamydia, what is the uptake of condoms, and even our national HIV and STI strategies, they've taken a long time to have any measurable indicator of stigma. And a few years ago, I worked on a project with the Centre for Social Research and Health and Scarlet Alliance, the Australian Sex Workers Association, because there was no measurable indicator of sex work stigma. It was like, well, how are we going to quantify this? How do we put it into then our advocacy documents to get governments to do something about it? But we do have, like at an international level, like bodies like UNFPA and the World Health Organization putting out country snapshots and country profiles where they rank more broad things around like rights and access and participation and equity, which I think is really useful. But one of the things I was speaking to someone about recently was the power of gossip and the ways in which data is collected at individual local levels about like, well, which doctor can you trust, who's not going to be transphobic, who is going to be like sex worker culturally competent, who should I go to? And so people collecting data at that kind of local level and sharing it amongst informal networks, that is really valuable data. And so, yeah, my interest, I guess, is then like how we can think about how data can be used, I guess, governed in ways that are collective, or it comes from the margins, and those are some of the prerequisites that we should be thinking about in terms of public interest sex tech.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Anna, I know that you've been doing your own research, most recently with your Annabot, and thinking about the ways that users might interact with AI sex bots in the future, but also how robot design might change to offer greater equity and inclusion. Can you tell us a bit about the project and what your findings have been so far?
Sure. So my current PhD work looks at sex tech in sort of 3 areas. So I'm looking at the representation of the body in physical devices. So I'm largely looking at these kind of, I call them like Frankensteinian amalgamations, because it'll be like vaginas and boobs and mouths all smashed into one. And so I've purchased and analyzed a whole slew of these objects, but then looking at how they connect to things like VR pornography and the sort of ways in which bodies are represented in this virtual space, and then thinking again about this in sex robots. So for the sex robot aspect of this, I had a sex doll that looked as close to me as I could possibly get. And it was hyper realistic. So it had freckles, veins, it was human size in proportion. And she became the Annabot. And so this was set up in a gallery during Melbourne Knowledge Week in essentially what was a peep show booth. And that was a very kind of intentional choice. And so participants could go into the booth and they were told that the Annabot was an AI prototype. In reality, we were utilizing Wizard of Oz techniques from human computer interaction research. So I was actually hidden and I was voicing the Annabot. And there were a couple of reasons why this research methodology was chosen. One was to explore this idea of what would it be like if you had a feminist sex robot? What would it be like if a sex robot challenged the conventions that are currently on the market, where you have these very sort of stereotypical representations of women, because largely the sex robots on the market are women and they're geared towards cis hetero men. And so, you know, what would happen if you broke that mold, and how would people respond to that? But also, how would people respond to an AI robot in general? And then kind of thinking also about bridging this gap between the sex doll and sex bot being this kind of non-feeling piece of silicone, and the way in which that's sort of used as a justification for both the design and the treatment of these devices. But also thinking about the public's reaction to issues around sex robots. So I was using the Annabot, able to kind of have the Annabot interview participants about what they thought about sex robots, what they thought about the way that the Annabot looked. Would they want to have sex with a sex robot? What would their ideal sex robot look like? And so there were a lot of really interesting interactions, because sometimes people were conflicted, where they would say their ideal, but then they would tell you what they thought a sex robot should look like. And they were often very conflicting. One was more politically correct and one was more normative. And so you see this sort of ways in which, again, those kind of normative bodies are really hard to die within the ways in which we're designing the technology. But also there were interactions that were really surprising. So thinking about people who fully, believed that this was an AI sex bot, and the ways in which there were really personal conversations, there were revelations, people confided in the Annabot. They used the Annabot as a resource for information, for guidance. And so again, thinking about the function of a sex robot beyond just sexual pleasure, but also thinking about sexual pleasure in a much more diverse and dynamic way, and the ways in which these devices can cater to, all sorts of different sexual needs and communities within that, but also thinking about how the design can facilitate that. So one of the kind of key takeaways or conflicts that I'm currently, wrestling with is, should we actually design these things to look like bodies? Or what are the ways in which moving beyond bodies, or beyond the kind of normative bodies that we so often see represented, could really have access and bring in a whole new range of people that really have largely been excluded from both sexual health and sexual studies, and the kind of normativity of sexual classifications now, but also, the markets for what the sex tech currently is catering to.
Awesome, thank you. With that, we are going to move away from me asking questions to inviting our Zoom audience and our physical audience to ask some questions of Anna, of Jenny, of Jazz, Zara, or myself. I think Jenny's going to keep an eye on the chat, the Zoom chat, if we can find that. And while we're waiting for that to come through, questions here. Yeah. Go for it. Oh, do we have a roving mic? Yeah, that's, otherwise the people online won't hear at all. Here we go, it's coming. They're going out of the room to come back in. They're trying to not run in front of the camera, which is very thoughtful. Thank you, but also awkward, which is the nature of the hybrid event.
Thank you.
Thank you. Go for it.
Two quick questions. The first is around the healthification of sex toys and robots and data. And it was I was really interested to hear you talking about those challenges, because as a lawyer, my mind went straight away to the fact that under privacy law, our health data is most protected. And that if sex data was treated more as health data, our privacy might be better protected in that way. So I would be really interested to get your comments on that aspect. And the other one is about sex robots. And I think it kind of goes back to something Jenny said at the beginning in your introduction, where you talked about the sort of marketing of these robots in a way like everything that you need and it doesn't need anything from you. And the way that some people form relationships with the sex robots. I was wondering if you saw the companies like encouraging this sort of behavior or these relationships rather than just seeing it as a sex object. And if that extended into, I guess, the vulnerability of the sex doll or sex AI, in the sense that, real relationships can't really form, or deep relationships can't really form without a mutual sharing, mutual vulnerability, mutual need. So if the need is only one-sided, I would think that relationship can only deepen to a certain level. So whether you'd seen any sort of play around that in terms of the sex robots.
Multi-faceted question. Should we do the robots first and then health? And I might actually, with the health one, Zara, in addition to her many other talents, is also a lawyer, so might have some thoughts on the health data versus sex data. But let's talk robots first. So the question about robots related to depth of relationships.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess Jenny first, then Anna.
Yeah, I think the idea. I mean, I think it's an interesting idea and question as to whether people form a relationship with a robot that is comparable to a relationship with another person. That's actually, I guess, that's a research question I'm actually looking to continue to explore. But I want to pick up on the thing about the idea of the devices not really needing much, and think that they're actually in their own way incredibly needy, and that's kind of the punchline, is that, like, if you think about the sex robots, they're very heavy and they're delicate. And, to maintain them requires a fair bit of work, let alone the maintaining, the Wi-Fi connection and everything else. So I think there's probably an element in that in which people develop, whether it's romantic attachment or whether it's just the sunk cost in terms of their significant financial investment as well. And therefore, people become attached to expensive things that they buy. but that's again not the same. That's again separating out a relationship with a device against a relationship with a person. But you're right in that the marketing tends to talk about these as if it's all one and the same. And we were actually working on an ethics application to be able to speak more to the companies that are designing and marketing these about the thinking behind that, but also to particular user groups in terms of the attachments that they're forming in them.
Anna, do you want to add or extend or say something different
Sure.
completely?
Yeah, so I have kind of two responses to this. The first is in looking at the marketing material from these companies, whether it's devices like sex toys or pocket pussies, or whether it's full-blown sex robots. They are often marketed as personified entities. So all of the sex robots on the market have names, and they're presented in this kind of girlfriend mode, or they're presented with a sort of personality, or they have this narrative attached to them. Additionally, there's also this notion, which I call like the clean woman, where there's a kind of no hassle quality that's brought into them. So they're easy to clean. They don't need a lot from you, as Jenny mentioned. And there's this whole kind of narrative about this idea of a girlfriend that gives you all of the perks, but doesn't require any of the effort or the hassle. But nonetheless, it's still a personified entity. In thinking about my own experience with the Anabot, I had to laugh at what Jenny was saying about the care required. So I had to order this thing, and it came, I experienced what I think a lot of sexbot people who purchase these things experience. I had to pick it up at the airport. It had to be forklifted into my car. It required quite a bit of effort to get it out of my vehicle. And then throughout the months that I had the Anabot, I kind of developed this strange personal attachment to her, where it sort of felt like a friend or something that I had to take care of. There was a delicacy to it, and this kind of companionship quality. And so as Jenny mentioned, we are interested in kind of pursuing this question, much further. But I think in terms of the way that they're being sold to consumers, there's definitely this kind of companionship quality, but it's a sort of best of all worlds, where you're trying to get all of the perks without any of the hassle, and then, still have this deep emotional connection. And that's the way that a lot of the personalities are also kind of developed as well for these things in an AI space.
It's interesting thinking about the gendered dimensions of the marketing, because when I was looking at some automated sex toys as part of the Everyday Data Cultures project, I looked at a men's smart toy that was marketed as, write your own code, optimize your performance, whereas the women's sex toy was very much framed around health and, donate your data for collective knowledge so that we can understand the mystery that is the female orgasm. Like it was, is the eternal, but also it's like you're a do-gooder by masturbating with this toy because you're contributing data. Whereas if you use the men's toy, it's like you've got a performance car and you're really optimizing things. And it is a very interesting kind of gendered framing of sex and sexuality. I will go now to Zara and Jazz, who both may have something to say about sex data and health data, and then I can see there's another hand up at the back, and I imagine there's a number of questions coming through on Zoom that we'll go to next.
Do you want to go?
Sure. Well, I will say just first in relation to the sex robots, similar to what Anna did with the Anabot, there's a project in Berlin at this cyber brothel with a doll called Kokeshi, and it's similar to that Wizard of Oz technique. That an idea behind it is that there are sex workers who are voicing the sex dolls, and they call themselves voice queens, and they call it analog AI. And the idea is that they provide some kind of human consciousness and subjectivity behind it, so that they can help to have conversations about consent and negotiate mutual pleasurable experiences in that analog way. But I am really interested in what in terms of the natural language processing, like Jenny's work, when you're looking at harmony and the something like 18 different personality profiles that you can choose, but we know that in real life, you know, people have sexual trauma, and like everybody will have an experience with someone where they will dissociate at some point, or they will be triggered. And you know, could we design sex robots that have those experiences, and so that then the users then also learn a kind of sexual literacy to grapple with those moments, you know, and learn kind of sexual communication and emotional literacy, rather than, you know, what's just kind of pleasing to us. Because I think that would be really interesting to have, like, listen more to radical sex educators in terms of, you know, relationships aren't easy. Sex is going to be awkward at some point. Like, we need skills to navigate those kinds of situations, and maybe that is a place where machine learning can assist in a different way. But in terms of the healthification of data, I had been talking to we were talking with Jenny and Meg Rose, who's working on pet robotics, and Ash Watson and Vaughan Wozniak-O'Connor, about all of the like similarities between these things, like pet robots and child's toys and sex robots. And Vaughan was who I see is on Zoom. Hi, Vaughan, was very kind to send me the link to, we were talking about the TGA requirements for medical devices and what would constitute a medical device, and he sent me the clause, which I can't remember off the top of my head, but I remember at first instance reading it and thinking actually some of this would fall under it, but then when I read it again, it was actually very narrow in its kind of thresholds around the like tracking and the purposes of the device in particular conditions. And I would love to talk to you more about this, and also Henry Fraser, around like regulation and health data, because I know Flow, when the settlement was made against Flow, which was the period tracking app, you know, there was concerns that was health data, because it was all about, you know, your fertility and your and a bunch of questions like what your PMS looks like, do you crave chocolate, or you know, and people providing all of this information that was then being shared with Facebook and Google. So yeah, I think that's a really interesting question that people, probably companies, have been trying to circumvent and evade in particular ways.
And the health wellness nexus is a very interesting, and well-being, which is another level again. Did you want to add anything to that?
Just one super small thing. I think there's great value in treating sex data as health data. It might provide a lot more robust protections to people. However, the sociologist in me wants to say it does little to get rid of stigma. So there's still a very thorny problem there that legal protections might not be best equipped to address.
Awesome, thank you. I did see a hand up a while ago, and they would have been exhausted holding it up. So can someone run the mic? Thank you. Had to bring it back down again while we were chatting. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Fortunately, I was wearing glittery gloves, so it's easy to find me again. My name's Meg. I'm from UNSW. Thank you so much for your fantastic panel. It's been really interesting. Just to frame my question, I work with people that legitimately befriend objects quite seriously, and they do see them as living beings that deserve friendship, care, and they do see the relationships as legitimate. And some of these people are actually neurodivergent. And so I know while we're laughing at that, that's actually a very serious way of life and experience for these people, and it's not actually funny. So I wanted to ask a question about cultural context and experience and how it might diverge and differ. So for context, again, the kind of people that I work with are from mostly Japan, but the experiences do map out across East Asia. And I was wondering, what cultural contexts in which are you guys currently working in? I'm not actually sure. Is it Australia? Is it America? Is it Europe? And have you considered branching out to explore other cultural experiences and how they might converge and differ with, I guess, the Australian context? Thanks.
The quick answer to that is the project that the Sextech project that we just described was the outcome of some seed funding from the ADM+S, and so it was primarily Australian, although because it was online we had international partners, and the Sextech school is international. From next month, Zara and I will be partnering with Jenny Sunden in Stockholm to run a comparative Australian-Swedish study on Sextech, the role of Sextech in LGBTQ plus people's sexual health and well-being, and that's a 3-year project, and that has been funded. I'm not sure what other people are working on in terms of cultural context so far.
I can speak a little bit to those robots.
Yeah,
if
thanks,
that's
Anna.
helpful. So prior to, I'm American, but prior to moving to Australia, I lived in Bangkok, and I did a lot of research looking at the sex tourism and sex industry there. So that actually provided a lot of foundational knowledge for the kind of beginnings of my own research. And I, to the idea of forming relationships with devices and with objects, it's not so much a point, I think, of humor as it is a potential opportunity. And I think it's often a consideration that's kind of pigeonholed or reduced in a very kind of simplistic way. And I think the opportunity for what that could be, I know looking at the chat currently, there's discussions about elder care robots and thinking about the spaces in which these devices can be designed, but doing so in a way that's responsible and thinking about what that responsibility means in terms of how individuals, how humans, how relationships are depicted by technology and what the technology is saying and mediating about those relationships.
Thank you. And to move to the Zoom chat, there's a question from Linda Olbach saying that she has 2 questions about AI sex bots, adding on to the previous questions. Are there or should there be boundaries of empathy with them? And could the panel collectively talk about research in this area, as sex and sex robots are still pretty much a taboo topic? We can look at marketing and social media, but is there research with actual robot owners?
Yes. I mean, just to say, like, I mean, every year there's a Love, Sex and Robots conference who often has, who present a lot of empirical research around human-robot interactions and also have a lot of representation and speakers who are idolaters and from different communities who have those relationships, definitely. I would just say quickly in relation to thank you, Meg, for your question, and that's really important to be centering neurodivergence in these conversations rather than having it as something that is sidelined, because there's so much to learn from neurodivergent perspectives. I know Bridney's podcast, she interviews Dave Catt, and there's many others who are very publicly visible speaking about their relationships. And I think there's lots to learn in other areas too. Thinking from a legal perspective, it challenges how the law thinks about marriage, how it thinks about monogamy, how it thinks about intimacy, how it thinks about love, and they're really important conversations that we should be having because we all form attachments to various types of objects throughout our lives. And I just wanted to add, definitely in terms of the cultural context, and there's so many different jurisdictional differences as well as cultural differences in these spaces, and people absolutely bring those contexts to the design, to the discussion, and yes, something I certainly hope to work with you, Fergatha, on, Meg, in terms of broadening that out.
Agree. I think, Meg, I really appreciated your question, and I'm glad that you're here to talk with us today. In terms of empathy, I think there's an opportunity for us to learn empathy through these devices and through relationships with them. And that's one of the reasons why I think it's important to think about who may desire to be a user of these devices, to engage with them, and to make sure that when they're being designed with diversity in mind to facilitate that.
I just wanted to add one small thing on empathy. And it's something I'm going to talk about later today. But one of the research I do is on AI chatbots and mental health. And what I'm going to be talking about this afternoon is on a particular app where you can design your own friend and have, conversations with them. And I won't, preempt the presentation, but you also have access to their private diary, which is very different with a friend. But it's very interesting to see how people might form certain kinds of relationships with chatbots. One of the people I spoke to in a separate project was talking about the value of chatbots, and she's someone who identified as having ADHD and being neurodivergent, and she was talking about how, for her, it would be really valuable to talk to a chatbot because she can see herself disclosing a lot more, because she referred to it as talking to herself, but at the same time having a lot of empathy back. This is contingent on training the AI over and over, but it is a marketing point. They are definitely marketed as chatbots through which people can access care. Very often it's the idea of the boundless friend that can care for you, with no boundaries whatsoever. But there is a lot of value that people find in them.
Thank you. Yeah, and it is interesting too to think of the parallels. Someone in the chat has talked about elder care robots and friendship and intimacy, and the ways that care often is a kind of transaction. And in spaces like elder care, in spaces like childcare, the reciprocity is not always, it works in different ways, and it's sometimes commercial and it's sometimes transactional, and it's no less of a relationship because it is that way. And I think it's interesting, as Zara was saying, to think about the ways that we have hierarchized certain modes of intimacy or certain kinds of relationship as more or less significant, and the way that plays out then through legal regulation, through what kinds of relationships are stigmatized and what kinds are not. And it flows then down into the space of sex tech.
And I think a lot of that stems from fear of human redundancy, especially all those conversations that become very politicized around sex robots and the role of sex robots. But it also, like you said, there's this idea, same as in pornography, of what is natural sex and what is natural relationships and what are natural bodies, and this is what they look like in a particular able-bodied white monogamous cisgendered form. Yes, and sex tech has a role to play in really broadening that out.
Do you want to add anything to that, Anna? Because your work has thought about that a lot, I think, in relation to intimacy and embodiment particularly.
Absolutely. I mean, I think, Zara's right on the money. I think we're seeing such a small sliver of what the potential for this technology really can be. And I think, as the design of these devices and these technologies and the various manifestations that they might take, there really is a responsibility to think of this in the broadest possible way in terms of, what are the needs, who are the people that these devices can cater to, what are the things that need to be considered, and thinking about how this is both a challenge, but also a potential opportunity, because it can tremendously shape technologies that we haven't even conceived of, and the ways in which these technologies can be integrated into our lives in a really healthy and productive and wonderful way. Because I think oftentimes, those normative ideas and that's the ease with which things are classified as being abnormal or hierarchical can really be very destructive and kind of making a binary yay or nay decision. And I think it's a much more nuanced and complicated issue.
We've got time for a couple more questions, and I see another hand in the room. Can we get a mic? Thank you.
Hi, thank you very much. It was impressive, and I really enjoyed it. I will speak from my ignorance. Are you considering the global political economy and the global hierarchization of sex tech labor in your work, or how is it impacting in your results finding? Because I'm super interested in that.
Yeah, we've just started that analysis. So Zara and Jenny and I are just starting the writing up of the deeper findings from the hackathon. The preliminary findings are in the report, but obviously we've got 3 days of data. And so one of the things we're really interested in is the ways that the sex tech industry picks up on themes or threads that we see in kind of broader labor markets globally, but more specifically the space of startup tech and entrepreneurialism, and the ways that those kinds of tropes, I guess, that we've seen, you know, that anthropologists have, like Gina Neff and Mel Gregg, who's in the room, have kind of been identifying as emerging, you know, since the dot-com boom in the late 90s. They're crystallizing in particular ways around med tech or sex tech or health tech now, and joining with other kinds of concerns around unstable economies, precarious employment, the desire to kind of become an entrepreneur as a way of sidestepping a dangerous or unstable economy, and also the drive that we see in tech spaces more broadly, quite often in the sort of the libertarian or Silicon Valley ethos of, well, you know, sex education has failed us, sexology has failed us, it doesn't represent diversity, people don't get good sex education in school, they don't understand their body and pleasure. What we need is more venture capitalists to step in and fix the problem by creating these privatized devices and apps that can be developed at scale and globally and will serve every niche for every purpose. And, you know, I mean, of course they can't, but if you look at the kind of slide deck pitch narrative around these devices, it's a real kind of drive towards, well, the free market will fix the deficits of, you know, the erosion of public spending or the social taboos or whatever it is that has created a kind of lack or deficit around sexual pleasure or sexual knowledge or empowerment or embodiment or whatever it is the problem is that is being fixed by the app or the device. And this is not to be, I guess, a smart ass about the people who are in the industry, because a lot of them are very sincere and working really hard to do a good job of what it is they're doing. But it's really interesting for us to think about the ways that in some of these pitches, you know, what we see as sexual justice issues are framed very much as individual problems that require an individual technologized solution, and it's a kind of interesting move in a lot of this space. Don't know whether you want to add anything.
I'll add something about kind of environmental sustainability and the labour politics, because I think that's such an interesting question. There's, you know, a big movement for eco-sexuality, so we're seeing more kind of sustainable sex toys coming forward with solar-powered vibrators and, you know, using mushrooms to make lithium batteries and things like that. We were talking recently, and Jenny was saying, you know, an eco-feminist approach might be to actually not create the sex tech at all. And I think that's really important because, you know, just thinking back to, like, the mantra of reduce, reuse, recycle, you know, there are things available that we could already be using as sex tech, people's electric toothbrushes or your washing machines as vibrators or things like that. Actually, there's not really the need to produce and consume more tech. So I think that's something to learn from. And also, it's really important to be mindful of the ways in which these technologies are being created and produced, and where they're being created and produced, and by whom and what labour force. Not just around, like, toys that, you know, that have phthalates or toxins in them. What does that mean for people's working conditions when they're creating them, for their water and the soil and the communities? And I think there's a lot to learn from ethical fashion in that sense, in terms of, like, you know, the movement for who makes your clothes, and people going to Zara and H&M and pinning little, like, stickers on the clothing that say who makes your garments, and then to do more investigation into that. So I am doing a project at the moment about the political economy of sex tech and looking at some the ways in which some of the kind of key sex tech devices that are on the markets, like where is the wealth going, who is behind the companies where their products produced, but I've only just started that. But it's absolutely something that I want to look more into in the future, in terms of how that labour is being outsourced and what are the experiences of people in an environment, particularly where like Western white feminism has been all about like liberation through orgasm. Like, well, actually, what does that mean for women of colour and women working in low-income countries in terms of their working experiences?
We have one question at the back again. Thank you.
Thanks. Just to pick up on that last question and Zara's comments, is anybody doing any work on thinking about where the labour comes from to develop the data sets that are used if something is run by an AI and if it's machine learning, then it's being trained on some data. Where is that data being produced? Who's producing it? What labour is being used to actually create that data? And is it knowing labour, or is it just data that's being collected from somewhere?
Anna, you're nodding. Is that something that you've looked at?
Just sort of briefly, I've been looking at it in terms of the way that actually data sets for AI sex tech is often just run-of-the-mill data sets that are used for other AI applications, and kind of what the ramifications of that are. I've been looking at it specifically in the context of images, and thinking about the ways in which the kind of rigid or myopic classification of images have really profound ramifications in terms of the way that gender politics and race and socioeconomic class are sort of classified within these data sets. I think there's quite a bit of research coming out of MIT and Harvard on some of these issues, but the specific sex tech application on a broad scale, I'm not totally familiar with it, but I know that there is a lot of kind of borrowing from just general data sets that are kind of shared for various applications. That's a kind of common practice for a lot of technology development.
And I would agree with that in terms of especially thinking about pornography and nudity classifiers that are used for social media content moderation. Like there's, you know, a lot of politics around the practices of consent and where those images have been extracted from, and often they're escort databases or they are dating websites and things like that. So, and then I think there's, it's really important to think about then how those images then get used for what I would call carceral sex technologies, and thinking about like that, you know, our government now wants to introduce age verification in order to access pornography, or the ways in which, you know, those images are used for body scanners and at airports and things like that. So that's a really important question. Thanks.
Awesome. Well, this has been a fantastic panel. We were nervous, but I'm happy with how it went. I don't know about these guys. Thank you all very much for coming, for your fantastic questions. Thank you for the questions in the chat, and for your interest and engagement and stimulation. That is lunchtime for the people at the physical conference. It may be lunchtime for people on Zoom too. Thank you so much, and we look forward to continuing the conversation over the next few days.